and are rarely kept. What should global citizens, activists do between now and the Paris summit in June to change that equation?
Thank you very much. First of all, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, why do our leaders always ask young people to inspire them? Why do our leaders always ask young people to challenge them? The science has been very clear. The IEA has been very clear. We cannot have any new fossil fuel development if we want to limit global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The first rule, when you find yourself in a hole, is to stop digging. We are in a climate crisis. So the very first thing that we need to do, that our leaders need to do, is to stop all new investments in fossil fuels. And secondly, to help people that are suffering right now on the front lines of the climate crisis, people who are not responsible for this crisis. To speak of Africa as a continent, it is responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions. But we are seeing some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So one, no new investments in fossil fuels, and two, helping the communities that are on the front lines of this crisis.
Well, thank you. And Prime Minister Motley, Barbados is both on the front lines of the climate crisis, and to Vanessa's second point, you have brought together the global community in Bridgetown last summer to craft a set of proposals to allow us to actually, for the first time, seriously protect vulnerable nations, vulnerable communities, and vulnerable families around the planet in a way that brings equity and justice to those who have long been left behind. What are the solutions you propose that would actually deliver the financing and the opportunity that the world so desperately needs?
I think I'm going to come to that in a minute, but I do want to say to Vanessa that we have to be conscious that we're not a one-issue world. And what we don't want is to ban investment in all fossil fuels and then end up with people dying from poverty or other sources that will lead to their demise. I think we can all agree that no new investment in oil, but we are clear that we are going to need a bridging fuel, which is natural gas, if we're going to sustain populations. How long we use it, I agree with you, needs to be as short as possible, but this is the real world and not just a conversation on a platform. With respect to the financing issues, look, without the oxygen, we're not going to be able to adjust ourselves to prepare for this crisis. And it's not climate change, it's a climate crisis. And to that extent, we believe that the multilateral development banks have to treble their lending. We believe that we have to confront the reality that there are already 50 countries, 52 countries to be precise, on debt row. And those are because of facing a polycrisis moment, from the pandemic to the climate to the increased inflation for whatever reasons. 3, we need to unlock far more private sector capital, but that means unlocking risk. And we need to deconstruct risk because the people in the global south borrow at far more expensive rates than the people in the global north. That's why the plant that was announced with such pomp in Glasgow for South Africa hasn't gotten off the ground. So, I mean, we can go into more details, Raj, but I'm conscious of the time. But suffice it to say that these and many other initiatives are part of the Bridgetown Development Fund, Bridgetown Agenda for Development Funding. You cannot have development funding as short-term money. You cannot have children, young people, rather, securing mortgages at for 30 years in a way that countries can only get development funding for 10 and 12 years to build schools. And it is that disparity in terms of how the financial system works, not just the World Bank and the IMF, but the whole financial system's focus on short-term gains, short-term everything, has literally propelled the developing world to the edge of a crisis. And I hope that we can change that mindset in, obviously, the IFIs, but across the entire financial system.
Prime Minister, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that. Why that is a radical vision of change and transformation. And you've been an eloquent voice for global leadership to make it real. What gives you confidence that such a bold vision of reforms and changes is possible today?
Because we want to save the planet, and because we want to make sure that people can live. The reality is that we do not yet know how to live on planet Mars. We only know how to live on Earth. And the same oil and gas companies, bankers, transport companies, insurance companies, they're living on the planet Earth too. So what does it make sense to earn hundreds of billions of dollars in profit for only 10 or 20 years rather than being able to sustain profit for the next century or two? The reality is that we need to put a place in the middle, and everybody needs to leave something in the middle. Nobody's asking to bankrupt companies. Nobody's asking to do the impossible with the international financial institutions. I think the consensus is developing. Here's the problem: scope and pace. If I have a heart attack and I'm going to the emergency room and I don't get help immediately, it doesn't matter how well-intentioned you are. So scope and pace matter at this point in time. Not 5 years from now, not 3 years from now, this year, right now.
Thank you. Chris, moving away from fossil fuels and moving towards clean energy is part of living up to the vision that Prime Minister Motley just laid out. Coldplay has been a leader in sustainable living and sustainable touring, and you've been a voice for real change and real accountability. And people follow your lead. Millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions around the world. How do you get people to follow you down this path, and what can we do together to get more people to follow to create a climate-sensitive future?
Thanks, Raj. Hi, Mia.
Hi, Chris.
Vanessa. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I had to go to the doctor. What was the question again, Raj? How do we get people to follow the lead?
How do we get hundreds of millions of people to follow your lead, the Prime Minister's lead, and Vanessa's lead to actually change our climate outcome?
Well, that's a wonderful question. What we decided to do in the last couple of years was just focus on what we could do and hope that other people might see it being successful rather than telling people what to do. Because we approached this most recent tour with the goal that we had to prove, or we have to prove, that thinking about the climate doesn't mean you can't do well economically, that being environmentally conscious is not a charitable thing, it's also economically viable. So we set out with that mission, and that's the way that we think we can show people to try it for themselves, is to show that it's profitable and sensible and not just philanthropic.
Well, thank you, and I think it's certainly true when you show that, you're likely to get many, many more followers than the rest of us, but it's a mantra we can all, in fact, live by in trying to be role models. Vanessa, I want to come to you before going back to others on the panel, because you've talked about loss and damage in the context of the COP climate meetings. The Prime Minister's been also an eloquent voice on loss and damage. What does loss and damage mean to you? And why are you so focused and passionate about ensuring that countries, including the wealthiest nations, kind of recognize and respect the concept of loss and damage in this fight?
Well, the climate crisis is evidently wreaking havoc on so many communities, not only across Africa, but many, across the global south. And many people are being pushed, beyond the places of adaptation. You cannot adapt to the loss of your cultures. You cannot adapt to, the loss of your history. You cannot adapt to starvation. For me, this is where loss and damage comes in. And that's why it's important that we not only aim at the establishment of a loss and damage fund, but that actual money, because it's still an empty bucket that needs to be filled. And, children that are starving, they don't feed on empty buckets, or communities that are, you know, experiencing cyclones or floods. So there's really a need for our leaders to keep up with their promises. There is always a gap between what is promised and what is done. And we've seen that, you know, from the $100 billion, and now we have this loss and damage fund. It's really important that our leaders keep up with their promises. We've seen countries like Mozambique have to get high interest loans in order to address impacts of the cyclone Idai in 2019 that left over 1,300 people dead. So for me, it's really what we need to do, because people are already talking about loss and damage and what is needed. It's about what leaders must do to keep up with their promises.
Well, I'm so glad you describe it that way, because loss and damage is about, as you point out, understanding that we need a systemic solution so people don't go hungry because of climate change's impacts on agriculture or because of the current economy's impacts on interest rates. Prime Minister Motley, you have made the point that you are, if I can say this publicly, tired of small one-off solutions and demanding a more full, systemic solution to the injustice that is represented. Well, how did you get to that statement, and how do we help create a movement that solves the injustice that got you there?
Well, I think we all know the injustice that got us there. When we started to create the new modern world in 1945, it was just 50 countries. We're now almost at 200 countries. And if therefore what mattered to 50 is what the world looks like, then we're not going to solve the problems of the almost 200. Secondly, we need to know that the purpose of the institutions when created were for reconstruction from the Great War. They were also to be able to fight poverty. You heard Hugh earlier say that 70% of poor people don't live in poor countries, they live in middle-income countries. But yet the rules of engagement and the rules of access exclude them. I'm glad that Vanessa talked about loss and damage, because countries do not need more debt. They need help to be able to fight a crisis that they didn't create. And therefore, if we're going to be true to the moment, we need to ensure that those countries and those communities have access to money that doesn't put them on debt row. So I believe that the systemic unlocking of risk, the systemic unlocking of international finance, that all of these things are critical, because guess what? In addition to the climate crisis in 2019, we got the pandemic. In addition to the pandemic of 2020, we got the war in Ukraine and the expenditure for coming out of quantitative easing in the northern world that led to inflation. In addition to the inflation and the pandemic and the climate crisis, looms artificial intelligence and looms also the future pandemic of antimicrobial resistance. If we don't solve today's problems today, God knows what else we're going to be solving on top of today's problems tomorrow. That's why we need to make commitments now, as opposed to 2 years or 1 year or 3 years, and moving from changing the equity to loan ratio at the World Bank from 20% to 19%, a lot of technical babble. What does it mean? $5 billion a year when the world needs $2.4 trillion. Now, bear with me, the $2.4 trillion is not only about public money, as you know. We probably need $500–600 billion of public money, and then a lot of that to unlock private sector capital. So we just need to we need to take the Nike ad, just do it.
Chris, I'm going to come to you on the Nike ad, just do it. Because you know the power of using your platform, using your voice, and using your fame to make a tremendous impact. And we have a question that global citizen Stephen Kirk from the United Kingdom asked us on social media. Stephen asks, how do we inspire others to participate in climate action? What pathway worked for you, and what would you recommend to say to others who are not currently engaged in this fight?
Okay. Well, firstly, what me or Prime Minister Motley said is that you just have to remind everybody that this is where we all live, and you can be a trillionaire, but if there's no planet, there's nowhere to spend money. That's the main thing, is to help people understand that this affects you too. Even if you think it doesn't at the moment, it will. So I feel that if you can engage people's own sense of self-preservation in a way, that's a really good thing, that none of us are immune to what's happening to the planet. I think that it's not really about someone who's famous or someone who's, it's not about preaching, it's about, this is why I love Global Citizen, it's about engaging your voice and understanding that if you join another 90,000 people and all email Ron DeSantis or whoever, you know, that makes a wave, and the power is in community. And Global Citizen is wonderful from my perspective because it's a non-elected force, you know, a powerful force. And yeah, that's my answer.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think your point about global citizens everywhere taking action, getting political leaders to pay attention, to live up to promises, to understand that hunger and starvation in a part of Uganda that you witnessed as a result, Vanessa, of climate change is not only a challenge in Uganda, but in fact a threat to every one of us, to our basic being. And so thanks to all of you for crafting a path forward for the world. I will say, as the Prime Minister noted, nearly 80 years ago, after the deaths of at least 60 million people during the Second World War, world leaders came together to prevent that kind of catastrophe from ever happening again. They established, as the Prime Minister noted, the UN, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. They created institutions to create a safer, more integrated, and more prosperous world. Now, 3 years after the start of a pandemic that killed at least 7 million people, and amid a climate catastrophe that, as Chris just pointed out, is an existential threat to humanity, we have not seen anything like that level of ambition, that scale, and that effort. We have 57 days until the Paris summit begins. What can we do, what can you do in those 57 days to meet this moment? That's the question we should ask ourselves today. Our incredible panelists have given us some good initial answers, but most importantly, they've given us and me hope that we can build a brighter future together. Thank you.
Hugh Evans, Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, and Global Citizen Ambassador, Hugh Jackman.
Today, increasing inequality and climate change threaten to undo a generation's progress on ending extreme poverty. The world's poor have done the least to cause climate change, and yet they are getting hit first and the hardest. Drought-induced famine is starving parts of Africa, and small island nations are at risk of devastating sea level rises. Where you live should not determine if you live.
To address these issues, I'm proud to announce the Power Our Planet campaign. We are calling on world leaders, the private sector, and the World Bank specifically to step up loans and funding for the world's most vulnerable countries so they can transition to clean energy and withstand natural disasters. And I'm pleased to announce that Prime Minister Motley is our campaign co-chair.
Thank you. Thank you, and please, Mia, and I just want to talk to the global north and the global south, because for the first time, our populations are facing the same reality in a very long time. We live on one planet, and if we don't get this right, there is nowhere else to go. And I need more than ever the citizens of the North and the citizens of the South to band together to send the message that we must act now to save tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. The Power Our Planet campaign calls for 3 big changes. Firstly, governments need to deliver on past promises. That's $16.7 billion in climate funding for vulnerable countries that have been promised but not yet delivered. Our team has crunched the numbers, and we need the US Congress to approve President Biden's $11.4 billion commitment. But because yes, absolutely, we do. But because we know that US Congress is in a deadlock, we also need the UK, France, Germany, Japan, and Canada to step up immediately. Secondly, the private sector has a hugely important role to play. We have specific asks for every company, starting with being net zero and having a time-bound action plan to achieve it. Private sector leaders, we're reaching out to you directly about how you can do your part.
And yes, we also need to change the notion that development money can be short-term money. It cannot be easier for a young person to get a 30-year mortgage than for a country to get development funds to save people and to save the planet. And your voice is needed to be able to say, short-term works for fast food, it doesn't work for development.
Okay, so to achieve this, we all need to get to work. Now, you're going to see Power Our Planet campaign at the G7, the G20, the Global Citizen Festival, and a COP. And you'll see it at a special summit hosted by President Macron in Paris in June. We need all of you to take action now. So scan the QR code on the screen to start. We must act today to save tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.